is in you. All my hope is in you.
Hi everyone, welcome to the online study of the Book of Ruth. I'm so glad that you are joining me to study through this amazing book. It is a book that is in the Old Testament, but is really just all about the coming Messiah and God's promises of redemption of his people. It is just chock full of all sorts of pointing to Jesus in the New Testament and what God was going to do for his people and for the Gentiles of the world. So let's start off just by reading the section. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. So we're just going to start off with the first 5 books today, but there's a ton in those, first 5 verses, but there's a ton in those verses. It's a relatively small book, but there's just a lot in there. It's chock full of information for us. So just as background, as the setting, the Book of Ruth takes place. It was written most likely by Samuel. We don't really know. The author does not identify himself or herself, but the most likely guess is Samuel, written sometime after the events took place. And the timing of the book is really, really important. It is crucial for understanding exactly what is going on here. There's a lot in the book that if you're just reading it by itself, it's hard to understand. But once you put it into its context, what the time period that God is talking about, it becomes more clear. It says right in the first passage, first verse, that it came to pass in the days when the judges rule. So what is the timing there? The book of Judges. The book of Judges took place after Joshua brings the people of Israel into the land, and before Samuel anoints Saul and then David king. If you're familiar with the book of Judges, it's a bit of a strange book. It's a book of a Bible, so there's purposes to it. But just reading it on its own, it seems really strange at times, because you have Israelites doing things that they really shouldn't do. They are doing all sorts of evil and getting involved with prostitutes and worshiping false gods. Even the judges themselves, who are the heroes of the book of Judges, are not really great guys. Some of them are very good, like Samuel, but others, like Samson, are Samson starts off really kind of bad in the book. He's a great example of a fleshly person. As he follows whatever he wants to do, he does. So he's hanging out, he's drinking heavily, he is cavorting with women who are not his wife, he's marrying Philistines. Even the Samson-Delilah interaction everybody's familiar with, it doesn't appear that Samson is married to Delilah. She's a Philistine, and he takes very lightly her repeated betrayal of him. But that's it in the bigger context of the book of Judges, because the theme of Judges is said repeatedly in the verses. There was no king in the land in those days. Each person did what was right in their own eyes. Sounds familiar, right? It sounds a lot like right now. But what happens in Judges is the people of Israel come into the land of Israel. They're brought from Egypt through the desert after 40 years, and they're brought into the land that's supposed to be filled with milk and honey. But because of their disobedience, they face opposition, first in the people that they have to drive out of the land, but then in repeated attacks by those same people, and spiritual attacks by those surrounding them through false idols and through the worship, the practices, which were often related to revelry, drinking, and sexual practices. So the people of Israel are constantly attacked during the time of Judges. Because, why? Because it's not because of God wanting to hurt them. It's because they're repeatedly choosing to turn against God. God tells them in the time of Joshua, go in, drive the people out, I'll be with you, I will fight your battles for you. The Israelites go in, fight some of the battles, win some of the battles, but then they sit back. They start compromising. They believe that they've done enough. They don't want to really take it further because that would involve extending themselves. So we start seeing a cycle. What happens is the Israelites follow God for a while, but then they get self-sufficient. They get complacent. They start thinking, well, life is good here. We don't really need the Lord. And they sit back and they relax and they stop following desperately after Jesus, after God. And in that time, as soon as that starts happening, then the sin starts creeping in. And they start worshiping false idols and interacting with the pagan tribes that are there, that are still in the land. And they start doing all these awful things that are recorded in the book of Judges. When it gets to a certain point, God warns them, and then he warns them again, and then he sends prophets. And generally sends prophets, but he warns them, and it gets to a point where they're not turning around. So God allows famine, or he allows the Philistines to come in, or he allows their enemy to come in and discipline them, to make them feel the results of their sin. Now, this is not to hurt them, per se. Yes, there is pain involved. The whole purpose of it is to turn them back to God. They have turned away from God. They're following after whatever is right in their own eyes. And God allows pain because the alternative is much worse. There's a short-term pain that pushes them back to the Lord. The long-term pain is the eternal punishment that would come if they keep going away from God. So the cycle is that God sends discipline in the form usually of the foreign power coming in and attacking them. And then he calls up a judge to rescue them. Once that happens, the judge comes and fights their battles, and Israel is restored. But once that happens, it doesn't last for very long before they start doing what is right in their own eyes again, and they fall away from the Lord. So over and over again through the book of Judges, this cycle continues until Samuel comes and the first king is put on the throne. But the interesting thing is, during this time, the book of Ruth takes place. So remember, each person does what is right in their own eyes. They unmoor from God's direction and God's law and start looking at it just from their own wisdom and their own logic. Two people looking at the same thing can come to a completely different conclusion. If you look around this world today, there's a million different opinions about what is right or wrong. That is why holding on to Jesus is so important, because you can justify just about anything according to what is right in your own mind. So when it starts off, the book starts off with, there was famine in the land. It's most likely that this occurred. We're in the latter part of the cycle where they have been redeemed, the Israelites. The judge had come and saved them from their oppressors. they start falling away, they ignore the warnings, and then a famine comes. God uses famine at times to try to discipline his children, the children of Israel. You might think about Elijah when he goes to the king, and the king and all the country is completely lost. They're chasing after false gods, and Elijah prays that it would not rain for 3 years, and it doesn't. And it's not just to punish people, it's to bring them back to the Lord. But what happens here? They're at that stage. There's a famine, which is God's call to his people to turn away from the pain and turn back to him. What does Elimelech do? Elimelech decides and looks around and says, this land is not going to provide what I need. This God gave the Jewish people the homeland, the promised land, is not going to provide what I need. So I need to leave and go someplace else. Can you see why this is the setting is so important? Because the setting is in a time when each person did what was right in their own eyes. Elimelech did what is right in his own eyes, but in the process, he left the promised land. If you remember also that the Old Testament is often at the outward, physical living out of New Testament inward truths, you can see how leaving the promised land is such a big deal. The promised land in the Old Testament is a picture of a spirit-filled life in Christ. The promised land is where we get when we are walking with the Lord and staying with the Lord. The promised land is not always filled with physical milk and honey. For us, the New Testament believers, remember, it's the inward spiritual truth. But if we're walking after God, that spiritually, even in the face of famine, even in the face of hardship, we will have an inward harvest. We will have inward milk and honey, despite what is going on around us. But that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen if we leave, if we turn away, if we walk away and don't trust God. As also the setting of the book is really interesting, because you have the mom and dad named Elimelech and Naomi, and their names have interesting meanings. Elimelech means my God is king. Great name, right? Naomi means pleasing. So at some point, we don't know whether it's with Elimelech and Naomi or their parents who named